So I'm so glad to see so many of you that we haven't seen in person for so long. I feel in a way that it's a family reunion, and I thank you, all of you who love language and literature and who come out to support the way that literature and art combine together to make a richer mix. So today, inspired by the exhibition Going Global, which explores the universal language of abstraction at mid-century, we look more deeply into what is lost, but more importantly, what is found in translation. Our visiting writers, Patricio Ferrari and Forrest Gander, close friends and colleagues, as well as collaborators, share a love of language, of wordplay, of close reading, and even closer listening. Finding a kind of intimacy and empathy in the act of translation, which, as Forrest Gander says, always changes us. Patricio Ferrari is a polyglot poet, editor, and literary translator. His work has appeared in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, the Southwest Review, Buenos Aires Poetry, and other publications. His recent editions and translations include The Galloping Hour, French poems by Alejandra Pizarnik, which was co-translated with Forrest, and the complete works of Alberto Caero by Fernando Pessoa, both published by New Directions. He is currently completing Else Here, a multilingual trilogy. He resides in New York City and teaches at Rutgers University and Sarah Lawrence, and happily for us, he's been doing some teaching here as well and will be in the coming week. And so we are very happy to have UCSB and City College students with us today, as well as faculty, and especially thank Joshua Escobar from City College, director of their creative writing program, for generating so much interest from the student body. Forrest Gander was born in the Mojave Desert in Barstow and grew up in Virginia. Significant periods of his life were spent in San Francisco, Dolores Hidalgo, Mexico, and Eureka Springs, Arkansas. He currently resides in Petaluma, California. With degrees in both geology and English literature, he is the author and translator of numerous books of poetry, fiction, and essays. He is the A.K. Seaver Professor Emeritus of Literary Arts and Comparative Literature at Brown University. Gander has received grants and fellowships from United States artists and the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the Guggenheim and many others. His collection, Core Samples from the World, was a National Book Critics Circle and Pulitzer Prize finalist, and his collection, Be With, won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 2019 and was longlisted for the National Book Award. His books have been translated and published in France, Mexico, Chile, Spain, Bulgaria, Japan, China, Germany, Turkey, Italy, and the Netherlands. In a world where borders can obstruct and words can become barriers, on this anniversary of September 11th, 2001, when the Twin Towers fell and we felt the noise and confusion of, as the poet Adam Zagajewski wrote, the mutilated world, a world he exhorted us to praise, try to praise, we must praise. Our poet translators, like Zagajewski, who read on this stage in 2018, offer the affirmative possibility of poetry and language as hope. What is possible with poetry? How does our language change, expand, embrace rhythm and sound? How, in the very act of listening, both in the tenderness of attentiveness and the looseness of letting go, we find music and meaning? How do we borrow eyes from another language? How do we build a world under the tongue? Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers today, Patricio Ferrari and Forrest Gander.
Buenas tardes a todas, a todos. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very, very happy to be here. I am thrilled to have such a crowd across ages and certainly across borders today. Thank you, Patsy, for that very kind introduction. And thank you, the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, in the name of Patsy Hicks and Chrissy Thomas, for being a place of bliss for me to have been able to work, to have been able to dwell in texts, and to be able to write, to translate, but also to meet great members of this community that until this summer I did not know, and some of whom are here today, and especially the City College students who I look forward to seeing and working with and collaborating this week. Thank you to friends who came from afar, from Southern California and beyond, and thank you from the heart a mi querido amigo Forrest por estar aquí conmigo. Es una felicidad leer con vos, estar contigo y compartir poesía. Poetry brought us together, and poetry keeps us together, and as Sagayevsky said, poetry and hope. In those two words, I bring those two as two hands, and in one prayer go to those of 9/11, 21 years ago, to those mothers who lost their children in 9/11, 21 years ago, and those who made it out and are still out and making families and loving in this physical world today. So poetry today brings us here. We're going to be sharing words in English and beyond, and that is always a celebration. As you all know, and it is something that more and more we live in this country, and that is diversity, culture, linguistic diversity. It is a place that hosts writers, artists, communities that have no place, and it is a place that is, we hope, and that is our work also as poets, to keep opening borders of love and of art and of language. 7,100 roughly languages are out there in the world. And it is in this country, and just to name one city, where we have the most diverse linguistic hub, if you will, in the history of humankind. Never before has there been a place with 800 plus languages in one single place. And that is New York, but New York is in the US, that is in the United States. 11% of the households in California speak only one language. Other than that, there's more than one language spoken, or a language other than English spoken. And that will continue to grow in the sense that hopefully more and more households will speak in more than one language. But more importantly, have to share more than one culture with the coming generation. The Galloping Hour. Parole du vent. Un cheval rouge traverse la mémoire d'anciennes nuits d'écrit. Les mâles nés dans mes yeux qui se rappellent, les mondes à la forme d'un cri. J'aurais aimé me voir dans une autre nuit, hors du délire d'être deux chemins du miroir, hors du délire d'être deux chemins du miroir. Façon de voir. Les yeux ouverts cherchent la dernière trace. Un cheval rouge amène des saisons colériques. On mord les bouts de son nom. On se perd dans les souvenirs d'un cri. On mord les bouts de son nom. On se perd dans les souvenirs d'un cri. Si tout est comme ça, où sont les rois du non-savoir? If everything is like that, where are the kings of unknowing? I bend myself around the galloping hour, the hour of cries that drag me after them, captive of a single, captive
to a single trace. Je m'étends sur les tons d'un galop, des cris m'étreignent la captive d'une seule trace. J'entends les bruits de ce qui détruit les vents. Cheval de la colère, amenez-moi loin de moi, loin de ces cris qui est à la place de la nuit. Words of the wind, a red horse. A red horse careens across the memory of ancient wailing nights. Evil emerges.
Aquí. Evil emerges from my memorious eyes.
The world given form as a cry.
How I would have loved to see myself some other night, beyond this madness of being both sides of the mirror.
Means of seeing the open eyes glimpse the dissolvent trace.
A red horse foretells choleric seasons.
Chewing the end of its name, we lose ourselves in the end memory of a howl.
If everything is like that, where are the kings of unknowing?
I bend myself around the galloping hour, the hour of cries that drag me after them, captive to a single trace. I hear the sound of what beats down the wind.
Horse of ire, bear me far from myself.
Far from this cry that stands in for the night. Oh, la lengua en el lugar donde se viene a esta tierra. Malong ou malong. Malong ou malompe. Malong est la prêtresse.
O language already here, when we come to this earth, my language or my lamp, my language is the priestess.
Je me rappelle les vents, les lilas, les gris, le parfum, la chanson et les vents, mais je ne me rappelle pas de ce qu'a dit l'ange.
Two.
I recall the wind, the lilacs, the gray, the perfume, the song, and the wind, but I don't recall what the angel said. Alejandra Pizarnik.
¿Quieres decir algo sobre la vida?
Alejandra Pizarnik was born in Argentina in 1936. Her parents came from Eastern Europe in the early 30s to the city of Buenos Aires, and they spoke Yiddish at home. Alejandra grew up both speaking Yiddish to a certain extent, mostly hearing in the household Yiddish that both of her parents spoke, and Spanish, of course, the language of Argentina. Now, at the time, and for many, many decades, as you know, French, for anyone with literary aspirations, was the passage obligé. So Paris was the destiny that Alejandra on and on and on kept writing about when she was very young as the place that she needed to go. Je dois aller à Paris. Il faut que j'aille à Paris. She writes, and she writes this in French, even though she is only learning French at the Alliance Française, right? So she's teaching herself also lots of French. And when she arrives in Paris, she writes both in Spanish, but she devours the surrealists and a lot of poetry from the previous century, from the 19th century, your Baudelaire, your Verlaine, your Rimbaud, and she begins to write prose poetry. And the prose poetry that you just heard, really at the beginning were seeds for what she will later do in Spanish in 1964 and so on, all through 1972 until she commits suicide early in life at the age of 36. But French is a language embedded in her practice as both a poet and as a translator from the French into Spanish.
And she's probably still one of the most imitated writers in all of Latin America.
And beloved poet, both of prose poetry and small gems, as the one that you heard into languages. Now, you will hear one of the voices, of the many voices of Fernando Pessoa. Read three poems from the Cairo, and Forrest and I will say a few words about him and Pessoa and multilingualism and the importance of writing in different languages and across genres. So I will read from the Portuguese and have the English. If you do not want to, of course, you just close your eyes and dwell in the Portuguese. Ao meu olhar, tudo é nítido como girassol. Tenho o costume de andar pelas estradas, olhando para a direita e para a esquerda. E de vez em quando, olhando para trás. E o que vejo a cada momento é aquilo que nunca antes eu tinha visto. E eu sei dar por isso muito bem. Sei ter o pasmo essencial, o que teria uma criança se ao nascer reparasse que nascera de veras. Sinto-me nascido a cada momento para a eterna novidade do mundo. I feel newborn with every moment to the complete newness of the world. Creio no mundo como no mal me quer, porque o vejo. Mas não penso nele, porque pensar é não compreender. O mundo não se fez para pensarmos nele. Pensar é estar doente dos olhos. Thinking is a sickness of the eyes. But for us to look at it and to be at one. Mas para olharmos para ele e estarmos de acordo. Eu não tenho filosofia, tenho sentidos. Se falo da natureza não é porque saiba o que ela é, mas porque amo, e amo-a por isso. Porque quem ama nunca sabe o que ama, nem sabe porque ama, nem o que é amar. Amar é a primeira inocência, e toda a inocência é não pensar. I have no philosophy, I have senses. If I talk about nature, that isn't because I know what it is, but because I love it. And that's why I love it. Because whoever loves never knows what he loves, nor why he loves, nor what it means to love. To love is the first innocence. Amar é a primeira inocência. E toda a inocência é não pensar. And the only true innocence is not to think.
So this is also connected, I think, to poetry across cultures and across time, that in every culture that's been studied, there's like three things that are held in common, that they have some kind of laws about what to do with people, human beings, after they die. They don't just let them lay there like animals. Almost all cultures have some kind of restrictions about incest, and almost every culture has poetry, often connected to visionary, to visions or healing or shamanism. And in our culture now, where actually there's, despite what some people think, there's a huge interest in poetry and a logarithmic increase in readership in poetry. I think it's very connected, especially among the young and people of color. And I think it's very connected to the fact that we live in such a rational culture, that we use language transcriptional in order to make transactions, in order to find out rational things. And that's only one expression of human being, of the way that we think and the way that we feel the world, and that poetry expresses something that's beyond just rational thinking. St. John of the Cross says, "Entreme donde no supe, y quédame no sabiendo, toda ciencia trascendiendo." I entered into unknowing and remained there without knowing, rising above all science. It's the unknowing that Pizarnik is pointing us to here, which can be much more important and much more expansive than the kind of rigorous knowing that our culture, that Western culture emphasizes.
Dia de chuva é tão belo como dia de sol. Ambos existem, cada como é.
A day of rain is just as beautiful as a day of sun. Both exist, each as it is.
Não tenho pressa. Pressa de quê? Não tem pressa o sol e a lua. Estão certos. Ter pressa é querer que a gente fosse adiante das pernas. O quê? Dando um pulo, salto para cima da sombra? Não. Não sei ter pressa. I can only sit where I am. Se estendo o braço, chego exatamente onde meu braço chega. Nem um centímetro mais longe. Toco só onde toco, não onde penso. Toco só onde toco, não onde penso. Só me posso sentar onde estou. E isto faz rir como todas as verdades absolutas verdadeiras. Mas o que faz rir a valer é que nós pensamos sempre noutra coisa. E vivemos vadios da nossa realidade. E estamos sempre fora dela, porque estamos aqui.
Yeah? I'm not in a hurry. In a hurry to do what? The sun and the moon aren't in a hurry, and they're right. Being in a hurry means believing we can get ahead of our legs, or that with one leap we can jump over our own shadow. No, I don't know how to hurry. If I reach out one arm, I reach exactly as far as my arm can reach, not a centimeter further. I touch only what I touch, not what I think. I can only sit where I am. And like all absolutely true truth, this makes me laugh. But what really makes me laugh is us always thinking about something else and living like truants from our own reality and being always outside reality because we're here. Actually, some of our philosophers have said that too. Ludwig Wittgenstein says, don't think, look.
Absolutely, and that was Caedo's philosophy. So, for those who may not know, Pessoa was born in Portugal in 1888, and very, very young, while in South Africa, where he lived between the ages of 7.5, roughly to the age of 17.5 for 10 years, those formative, very important years coming into language, he felt the need to write under different names. And that entailed writing under different styles, across genres, and at some point under the name also of women. And Pessoa, at some point, for so many years influenced by the British poets of the times. You can imagine South Africa was even more British than Britain itself, right, at the turn of the 19th century. And this is the time when Gandhi, for instance, was in Durban, beginning to practice law. A very diverse place. And Pessoa understood what many other important authors understood at the time in different ways. Pound, for instance, or Yeats. The importance of cultivating or exploring otherness. Caedo is one of those others that Pessoa created. But not just one more other, but what Pessoa came to call in a letter to a friend, he said, pardon me for the absurdity, but I gave birth to my own master. And the master, what would the master teach both to Pessoa and to the other coterie of voices, which Pessoa called heteronyms, different from pseudonyms, right? A heteronym, writing under a different name but being a complete different person. So Caedo's philosophy is all about seeing anew for the first time, being a child. And of course, Pessoa knew this because of his own practice coming into poetry in a language other than his mother tongue, being Portuguese. So from a very early age, he was exploring sounds in different languages, also French. And as you can remember, Afrikaans was also spoken in Durban at the time. So on the street, Pessoa had all these sounds, right? And this is very important for those poets who lean in and listen, dwell, listen. And Pessoa has fascinated me ever since he came into my life. And one of the reasons being that when you get tired of one voice, you go on to the next.
So this was a question I was going to ask Patricio, but first, you just heard Patricio translate and read in 3 different languages. There's so few people that can do that and do it as well as he does. Just want to... He's not a U.S. citizen yet, but maybe next year. And I think he's working on being one of our national treasures. So a lot of my translations, I've translated multiple books by the same writers. And I'm really curious. And so in doing that, I come to really live inside someone else's head. And I think that's the beautiful thing about translation, that it's a spiritual activity in that way. You have to disappear yourself so that you can welcome in the music of someone else's mind. You have to be barren enough to let that in and then try to reproduce it. So in working with the same authors multiple times, I feel I've gotten deeper and deeper into their minds. But Patricio is translating this author who is writing in 47 different personalities. And so I'm really curious, like, what's that like?
One of the most fascinating statements that I read early on when I moved to Lisbon, and it was with Pessoa's papers, because one of the fascinating aspects of Pessoa is that he, dying at the age of 47, so much was left unpublished. And in manuscripts, and typewritten manuscripts, and mixed manuscripts. So you have to figure out who is writing what, and also in what language. Right? Now, what was fascinating about Pessoa was also to see who influenced who. So the layers within the work. So, for instance, hearing the echoes of Whitman in Caedo, but he writes Caedo. So, of course, Pessoa doesn't just create a name and a last name and a signature here, as I will show you, but also full biographies and influences. And Caedo is this poet who lives in the countryside with his aunt, and he has no books. He's sort of like a walking Socrates, right, who doesn't write, but he will have his Plato. So Campos, Ricardo Reis will be the disciples taken down, and to hear every now and then Whitman in Caedo, but certainly a lot more in the city poet, Campos, is one of the most interesting things, or it was and continues to be for me, to hear a poet who Pessoa read in one language in a different language. So to hear Whitman in Portuguese, and not only thematically, because that would be simple, but also rhythmically. And that is something that Pessoa did. And how did he do it besides his great talent and genius, if you will? He worked. He worked a lot. And he dwelled in the texts and read out loud Whitman and the great poets over and over and over again. One of the practices that Pessoa that accompanied Pessoa very much, because you see it in his diaries, is the art of rereading the great ones to accompany oneself. And that also fascinated me, his discipline and his devotion to literature. And also from very early on, his practice as a translator. As the great ones, he understood the importance of translating from English into Portuguese, and he brought into the Portuguese language some of the great voices that hadn't been translated, or understood that needed a new translation, as every generation does, right, of some of the great works. Do you remember, Forrest, the first time you encountered Pessoa, how that was? Was it the Book of Disquiet?
It was a translation of the Book of Disquiet.
And what did that, what touched you, if anything, in particular, when you heard about the heteronyms or Pessoa's prose or anything that?
I just thought, what a wild guy. 47 different personalities that influence each other and create different poetries. And I got excited and went to Portugal to see his house and was awfully disappointed that it was so sterile, because he was he was very sloppy and had stuff all over, and you don't see any of that. But this thing that Patricio says, that poetry, so much of what poetry is music. And so this is why Google is never going to translate literature well, because it's not just about semantic meaning, it's about musical meaning. And that's something that Patricio has studied for a long time and brings to his translations. There's in talking about translation and sort of the ways that it's impossible and still so necessary, I've come across a song that Sitting Bull recited to his people after, remember, Sitting Bull leaves the country after the battle where he defeats Custer, and goes to Canada with his people for 2 years, and it's the worst winters Canada's seen in 100 years, and his people are starving to death, and he has to come down and surrender. And he does that, and the terms of surrender are awful. And he goes back to his people, and he recites a poem to them. And the first line of the poem is, and this is in Lakota Sioux, Ikke size wayon kon he. I could talk too long about this, but the interesting thing about this in terms of translation, Ikke size wayon kon he. Ikke size wayon kon he. It's the exact rhythm of the Western Meadowlark's song, which happened to be Sitting Bull's totem animal that protected him, from childhood. So a translator would not only need to translate the semantic meaning, but would somehow have to account for this, because this would have been recognized by all of the people who heard it. It's a significant part of the poem.
Thank you. I was just trying to see whether it was it 3 beats or.
Yeah. On my computer, I have the Meadowlark. It sounds just like that.
So now we're going to move on to one of the most important and exciting poets and prolific in Mexico City, who Forrest has been translated for roughly 20 years, and we'll hear. Do you want to say a few words about Coral, or first read and then?
Maybe first read a couple poems.
Dale.
These poems are from one of her most recent books, which in Spanish is called Debe ser un malentendido. It must be a misunderstanding. And this book is really a book-length poem focused on her mother, who's dying of Alzheimer's. And of course, it very much interested me because my own mother died during this pandemic of Alzheimer's. And I wrote poems also that are now too painful for me to read from. But when I read Corral's poems, she came from such a different angle. And she builds up this character, this woman, with this resilient, creative response to losing her own mind, that we sort of fall in love. It's not such a sad book. It's a book really of attentiveness and love. So, las piezas del rompecabezas se pierden, pero no la mirada que lo sabe suyo. Las formas, los objetos se funden, se desmoronan, pero el sentido del conjunto persiste entre momentos, entre ficciones, bajo fracturas incesantes, como un umbral, un asidero. The puzzle pieces get lost, but not the look she knows to be hers. The forms, the objects, they merge, they crumble, but a feeling for the ensemble remains. Between moments, between fictions, despite constant fractures, like a threshold, a handhold. I think I'll just read this one in English.
Leo?
Yeah.
¿Querés que lea el español?
Sí, claro.
¿Sí? Observaciones. Ese pájaro que baja a picotear el asfalto, muy cerca de su pie, es algo que jamás ha visto. No hay con qué compararlo, nada que lo emparente con aquel gato o que comparta con ese arbusto. Todos son habitantes inesperados, contundentes presencias del espacio que, de momento, compartimos con ellos. No hay reinos que los reúnan o los separen en sus precisos territorios, ni palabras donde se empalmen este que ahora agita las alas y brinca entre la hierba y el polvo, es único.
Observations. That bird dropping down to peck the asphalt so close to her foot is something she's never encountered before. There's nothing to compare it with, nothing that links it to that cat, nothing it shares with that bush. They're all unanticipated tenants, convincing presences in a space that for the moment we share with them. There aren't kingdoms that harbor them or separate them out into their particular territories. No words that link them together. This thing here, fluttering its wings now and hopping between the grass and the dust, it has no likeness. And ¿quieres leer este conmigo?
Sí, dale, uno y uno.
Okay.
Alzheimer, seguimiento.
Alzheimer's, follow up.
¿Quién es el presidente de este país?
It's the doctor. Who is the president of this country?
Pues depende. Para unos es uno, para otros es otro.
Well, it depends. For some, it's one person. For others, it's someone else.
¿Cómo se llama esto?
What is this called?
No sé, doctor, porque yo no uso eso, solo usted.
I don't know, doctor, because I don't use that. Only you do.
¿Cuántos hijos tiene?
How many children do you have?
Muchos.
Quite a few.
¿A qué se dedicaba usted antes?
What did you used to do?
Ahora me va a pedir que dibuje un reloj.
Now you're going to ask me to draw a clock, right?
¿Usted bailaba?
Did you like to dance?
Sí, claro, por supuesto que bailaba.
Yes, of course I danced.
¿Y viajó alguna vez?
And did you ever travel?
Sí, claro.
Yes, naturally.
¿A dónde?
Where to?
Pues a donde iban todos.
Well, to the same place everyone went.
Gal.
All right. So I was going to talk real quickly, briefly, about a translation project I'm working on now, and the notion of impossible translations. People sometimes say, "Oh, that can't be translated; it's impossible," and of course, all translation is impossible until the right translator comes along. But that Oglala Sioux poem that I recited to you, how to translate that, getting the meadowlark song in for a culture of people who wouldn't necessarily recognize it. Or in the 4th century, is Yunta Huang here?
Sí.
Yunta's here, yeah. He knows this. In the 4th century, Yunta Huang wrote a poem. He's lived a long time. Under the pseudonym of Su Hui. Actually, he didn't write it. There's a 4th century palindromic infinite poem written by a woman whose name comes to us as Su Hui. It can be read, it's a long poem, it can be read horizontally, it can be read crosswise, it can be read in reverse. Almost an impossible poem to translate. I've worked on 2 books by a Bolivian poet named Jaime Sáenz, who's deeply influenced by the culture of the Bolivian Aymara, for whom, conceptually and linguistically, the future is behind them, and the past is in front of them. The word for the past is also the word for front, and the word for the future also means back. And when older Aymara talk about the future, they'll point behind them. This is connected linguistically to their culture. I don't have time to get into that. We can talk maybe later. But how would you translate from a language where the entire conceptual and linguistic sense of time was different from the culture that you were translating into? And then finally, another sort of impossible poem is the Siri Buvaleya. A little background on this. Sometime in the 1st millennium in South India, there was a Jain monk named Kumudendu Muni who composed on palm leaves what is perhaps the most radical and spectacular work of literature in any language. Pretty big claim. The story doesn't have a real precise beginning, but in the court of Rishabhanatha in Uttar Pradesh, India, about 800 CE, which is the same long dynasty that gave us Buddha and Lord Rama, there's a philosopher-poet, Kumudendu, who watches his king divide the kingdom between his 2 sons. As in all the stories, of course, the 2 sons go to war over that territory. And the younger son, Bahubali, wins. But he's so disgusted by the enmity that twisted his mind, he decides to hand over his whole kingdom to his brother and make himself a Digambara, a member of that sect of Jain monks who renounce ownership and wear no clothes. He becomes known as Gomata and is memorialized in a 57-foot-high statue that I visited, constructed in 983, long known as the largest freestanding monolithic statue in the world, in Karnataka. Gomata's older brother accepts the kingdom, but he feels contrite. And inspired by his brother's renunciation, he asks Gomata to teach him how to become wise. And here's where the story gets pretty interesting. Gomata remembers that after their kingly father bestowed the territories upon his 2 sons, he called for his 2 daughters to sit on his lap and hold out their palms. In the Jain tradition, the giving of knowledge is more valuable than the giving of food, shelter, or money, and it was to his daughters that the king bequeathed his most lasting gift. On the palm of one daughter, he drew the numbers 0 and 1. On the palm of the other, he drew the 64 letters of the Kannada alphabet. That's Kannada, the South Indian language. Between this number and these letters, he told them, you'll have access to all the knowledge of the world. Gomata follows his father's example and gives to his brother a cipher for the wisdom he seeks. And Kumudendu, the court poet, watching all this drama, thinks, hey, it would be a pretty good idea if I rendered this long philosophical poem I'm writing into a code, so that if my life work was destroyed, it could be reconstructed over and over. So it comes about that Kumudendu writes and codes the Siri Buvaleya, a poem of some 600,000 verses, which makes it 6 times larger than the epic Mahabharata. Within its structure, there are reputed to be hundreds of languages in at least 18 scripts. The Siri Buvaleya was recognized in its time as a major literary work. Copies were made and distributed among Jain sects, but over the century, even these facsimiles gradually disappeared. Then in the early 1950s, one handwritten copy on Kori paper was discovered by a man named Yalapa Shastri in a village near Bengaluru in Karnataka. The owner wouldn't part with the book, so in order to win his confidence, Shastri married the owner's niece. The strategy didn't work. Shastri still didn't get to hold the book in his hands until the owner died, and because Shastri was really poor, he had to sell his wife's bangles to buy it. The Siri Buvaleya, like Lucretius's On the Nature of Things or Parmenides' On Nature, it's a philosophical poem that contains sections on mathematics, chemistry, astronomy, medicine, and space travel. It also contains versions of the Bhagavad Gita, Rig Veda, and the Upanishads and other texts. Let me jump ahead, yeah. So the multilingual poem can be rendered in the meter of classical Kannada poetry, and I say rendered instead of written because the work's most unique feature is that it's composed of numerals, not words, arranged in a crossword fashion in chakras or matrices of 729 squares, that's 27 by 27 integers, whose systemically coded patterns can be translated into phonemes and words. Sometimes the sentences are embedded across the entire chakra, but often the sentencing is organized into what are called magic squares within the larger structure. So let me jump ahead. So this larger chakra, which you saw, can be divided into 9 by 9 cells, or magic squares, in which each number corresponds to a Kannada phoneme. There's a cipher that's published in the recent book, which we first saw in the first slide about this, which shows a series of well-defined steps, for instance, starting with the middle number of the first line, 3 here, and then following a strict sequence common to even today's recreational mathematics for linking phonemes into words and into sentences. In this, the top left cell of the chakra, the deciphered sequence produces the Kannada phonemes that construct the sentence. Do you want to read it? Okay. This is my Kannada. Aum barade guru viresana samathadim gamanis aravathanak akshara samyoga vimala. Do I have this? I think I have this actually written down in the next slide. Yeah, here we go. So we take those phonemes, we put them together, and we can read this sentence, which can be translated. I have written, with Guru Virasina's approval, this observation of the union of 64 letters. The next word is someone else's name. It's the beginning of a new sentence. I can't say. This is as far we've translated, because this involves ancient Sanskrit, ancient Kannada. It's been really hard to translate, and has involved computer specialists, Sanskrit scholars, and literary translators. So I can't say whether the Siri Buvaleya contains everything it champions. Hundreds of languages and hundreds of work of literature, all compressed into a fantastically inventive numerical code that some have called the world's first microchip literature. But even without a bunch of empirical corroboration isn't human experience, with all that constitutes it, incomplete without the Siri Bouvelea. The poem says to us, here is everything from the past into the future of space travel. Take what you don't already have, in any language you like, from this, the infinite cosmos of a poet's imagination. For me, the Siri Bouvelea needs no further authentication to be marvelously what it is.
So what Forrest probably didn't tell you is that this is an unpublished document that was just found that Borges wrote.
Yeah,
Right? This is just,
it's very Borgesian.
it's very Borgesian. And what, Forrest, this is just, I mean, where to begin? This richness of numbers and music and language. What does this tell us about the nature of language and the boundlessness, possibilities, but also the layers of language?
Well, this is basically what Patricio is getting to in his own poetry, which is polyglot, which includes multiple languages in one language, and maybe a kind of template for the future. Perhaps as our borders continue to become more porous, we will begin to speak, all of us, in multiple languages. Those of you who have been to India know that the language changes basically every 30 miles, and that you won't find any conversation you won't overhear that doesn't employ at least 3 languages, very local languages, probably some Hindi and some English, at least. And that interests me as a model for the breakdown of nationalisms and the things that cause nationalisms that come out of nationalism, like war, almost all wars. And maybe poetry can be involved in this. And maybe poetry like your own, Patricio.
And that your own too, Forrest, more and more. I know that you've been writing in Spanish has been coming in more and more into your own work, and I've noticed that maybe earlier on from titles, certainly names, so a lot of the toponymy from, say, Mexico or Latin America, but now more and more full lines in Spanish. And if you want to say something about what that is doing to the English, how that is that.
So I think a language dies when it doesn't change, and one of the strongest things that changes language is what it imports from other languages, and that in our culture now in the U.S. in North America. Our language is strongly impacted by the Spanish language, and I'm interested in how that can refresh and provide for English new syntactical structures and new image repertoires, new sounds, and a new poetics that I think will continue to freshen our language.
Do you want to say one or two words before you read for us your poem about India, what India has done to your having been with and through India, certainly working from this poem of translating this work, but even before to Twice Alive in the Sangam Poetics. For those who haven't.
So we're finishing up now. I'm going to read one poem and then of my own, and Patricio will read a poem of his own, where you'll see what I'm talking about in his language. Mine is influenced by Sangam poetics. So I'm married to an Indian artist named Ashwini Bhatt, who's sitting right here. And so I've become very interested in the culture that she grew up in. And one of the things she turned me on to, because I'm also very interested in and very connected to eco-poetics, ecology, to the crisis, the ecological crisis that we live in now. And looking for, besides like writing poems that recite all of the horrible facts that we already know, looking for models, positive models of people who had a different relationship to their environment than we do. So 2,000 years ago in southern India, there was a poetry there was a flourishing of literature and a poetry that came to be called Sangam, which means convergence. And one of the main kinds of poetry in that tradition was called Akam. And in Akam poetry, it was considered not only unethical, but impossible to write about your emotions without referencing the environment around you that impacted your emotions, that was part of your emotions, that was rhythmically involved in your emotions. And so all of that poetry talks about human emotion in relationship to the place where it takes place in southern India. So I guess this is the California happens to have the same 5 major landscapes that southern India has, and so I ended up writing a series of poems influenced by Sangam. Oh, okay, great. I thought it was like he's pulling us off stage already. So I've written a series of poems influenced by Sangam, but placed in California. This is called Immigrant Sea, also thinking about immigration, and this is a period of the greatest human migrations and largest human migrations in all of human history, and also and all of the troubles that come with migration, and then the ocean, the sea, on every shore that the waves land, the waves are welcomed immigrants on every country. Immigrant Sea for Ashwini Bhatt. Aroused by her inaccessibility, he aches for more of her life to live inside him. Watching the breakers, standing so close he can feel heat coming off her wet scalp. What is his relation to this person before him? So familiar and foreign. The way he searches out her face, he searches out himself. Gusts thrash crests of swell. Spring grasses twirl circles in the sand where they stand without speaking. She wants him to know it's all charged, even grass, positive, pollen, negative. So when grass waves, it sweeps the air for pollen. He feels electricity all around, as though the wild drama of the coming storm were already aware of them, foreigners on this shore. Little sapphire blue flowers speckle the dunes. He wonders if he has let himself flatten out into a depthless sheet, like escalator stairs, whether in the end he'll disappear underground without the smallest lurch of resistance. But when her lavish face turns toward him, beaming, the corners of her eyes wind wet, he yields to that excess. He reappears to himself. Thank you. You too.
Thank you for bringing all that east and California, east and west and waters without which we wouldn't have anything. I open Mater Buenos Aires, which is the first volume of the trilogy. I was so fortunate to be able to write at Brown University 5-6 years ago. And since I've turned the manuscript into a more multilingual work and divided it into 3 volumes, Mater Buenos Aires being one. And as you can, of course, tell, we are in a given place, but slightly different. There's a Y and not an I, and that may say something about what may happen or be happening in the book with the place. But also the word. It may ring a bell if you speak German, also English, certainly. And as you go into the book,
it's all about movement, Europe, the Italians, the Polish, the Germans coming in across the waters. It opens in prose poetry, and then we come into a section where it's all about childbirth, coming into language, into other waters, the amniotic waters, and also the waters of sound, in which we will continue to live all throughout our lives. So this poem, and also is a poem that thinks about the one that you will hear from, Infant, is a poem that thinks about what translation is, or maybe what the possibilities of translation, which I try to do throughout not only the first volume, but the second volume, which dwells in the US, the varieties of English. So in Skeins of America, that is my working title, I touch on different Englishes depending on where you are, California, Texas, the East Coast, New York City, certainly with a diversity of languages, to end in that else here in the world, India, Portugal, France, and so on. So this is one of the first poems that will bring the question and ask the reader, what is an original? And as you see this poem, and I'll start in Spanish, but that's not because I just want you to maybe start in sound and not with the semantics of meaning. But that doesn't mean that the poem was born in Spanish. The poem really was born in both languages. So there's no original and there's no translation, or both are translations, if you will, or both are versions. Infant. En el principio no era el verbo. Alguna vez solo cuerpo, todo en temblor. Latín para infant, in, no, opuesto a fans, hablante, infant, uno vacuo de lenguaje, infant, one devoid of language. In the beginning was not the word. Once only body, all a tremble. Latin for infant, in, not, opposite of. Fans, speaking. Infant, one devoid of language. From genomes through phonemes and mothers, silhouetted voice. Her ventral resonance instills primal riparian rhythms. Infunde fluyentes ritmos primarios. It too is untranslatable. Deep, bearing, and young, she transmutes the void. El vacío, coalescent you in the grammar of waters. Coalescente pronombre en la gramática de las aguas. Nace la lengua, nascent tongue in the grammar of waters. Nascent tongue, nace la lengua. And I would like to close with the piece that I wrote for the museum based on, and if you haven't seen it, please stop by at some point by the museum upstairs to stare and to dwell in front of this piece by Richard Anuskiewicz, Center Green, 1979. Center green is the first eye, perhaps orange the second. And throughout our mere existence, contrasting pairs return in endless patterns. All around us, their fusion speaks in flux. Beacon to this blend, but blind to its conjuring, you fixate now on the pulsating verdancy, staring back at your silence, the long stria, spin an elliptical iris, mercurially. Like the solar eclipse when the moon passes, obscuring the familiar fire, a spherical luminous blackness expands like a sound burst. So motion churns, utterances in tongues take over geometric borders, unfix or inside a kaleidoscope of accents. Muchas gracias.